So first we have Jessica Piper. She is the executive director of Blue Missouri and host of a weekly podcast called Dirt Road Democrat.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see everyone here.
Yes. Then we have Representative James Talarico. He was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 2018 and currently serves on the Public Education Committee, the Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee, and the Calendars Committee. You want to say hello?
Hey, everybody. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining. Molly, I see you raise your hand. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat or in the Q&A. Then we have Leslie Briggs, who is the legal director for Oklahoma Appleseed Center for Law and Justice and a plaintiff in the case against the public Catholic charter school in Oklahoma.
Hey y'all, glad to be here. Excited to talk about what a playground for bad policy my state has become and what we can do about it to stop it.
Absolutely. And last but not least, we have Dr. Caroline Mala Corbin, who is the professor of law at the University of Miami School of Law.
Hello. Looking forward to tonight's webinar.
Yes, thank you all for being here. So first, I'm going to ask you guys some questions so I can hear your awesome answers. So first, how has the Supreme Court paved the way for taxpayer funding of private religious schools through school vouchers? And what about it is problematic? Caroline?
All right. So once upon a time, when we still had an establishment clause, the main question about funding for religion schools was whether giving taxpayer money to religious schools would violate the establishment clause. The answer was often no, but at least the court had some conditions for government funding that ended up at religious schools. Now, the question is not whether government funding violates the establishment clause, but whether it violates the free exercise clause. So now, in other words, it's not just that the government may provide vouchers to religious school if it wants to, even if all those schools are Christian, but rather governments may have to provide vouchers that can be used at religious schools, even if the state doesn't want to. And a lot of states don't. Many of them have provisions in their constitution that bar funding of religious schools. So what it means now is if a government decides to provide vouchers to private secular school, it has to provide vouchers to private religious schools. And of course, again, most of religious schools are Christian. So the government can no longer decline to fund religion. You might be thinking, why? Well, it's this other religion clause, which is the free exercise clause. According to the Supreme Court, to give money to private secular schools, but not private religious schools, is, according to the Supreme Court, discrimination against religion. And it doesn't seem to care that the Christian schools getting the money themselves often discriminate. Very often they refuse to hire LGBTQ teachers. No problem, your money still goes to them. Many of them teach that women are second-class citizens and can't hold positions of leadership in the religion. No problem, your money can still go to them. Right? It's as though the establishment clause does not exist. So again, if the current rule is if a government decides to fund private religious schools, it is discrimination against religion if it does not also provide funding to private religious schools, regardless of whether the religious schools themselves have very problematic policies. So that's kind of where we are now. The next question is whether they're going to start expanding this reasoning, not just for funding of private schools, but funding of public schools. So really the next challenge may be that if a government decides to have charter schools public schools, but they're charter schools, there might be an argument mounted that if you give money, if the federal government, if a government gives money for secular charter schools, then it also has to provide money for religious charter schools. And this would not just be providing vouchers that people could choose to use for a religious school. This would be the government directly funding religious schools. And that would take us into uncharted territory. Charter was an unintended pun, but it would be really problematic. I'll stop there. I'm a professor. I could talk for the whole hour, but I will stop there.
I think it is. I mean, it's a good segue. And Olivia, I don't know if you wanted to do this segue, but I can just pick up the ball and run with it. But it's a good segue into what's going on in Oklahoma, because that very issue is pending in our courts in two different ways here. So I mentioned at the start of the call that I'm the legal director at an organization called Oklahoma Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. And we do litigation on our own, and we work on these issues as far as education justice is concerned, but I'm currently serving as one of several plaintiffs in a lawsuit trying to stop the very thing that we were just talking about, that the direct public funding of a religious charter school. Query over whether it's going to be considered private or public. I mean, that's part of what the litigation is going to be getting at, that the Saint Isidore is the name of the school. They've entered a contract with our state. They've been approved by our state virtual charter board to go forward and build this Catholic charter school virtual. It's going to be a statewide school. It's not going to have a brick and mortar location as far as I know yet, but it will be a charter here in the state, which is directly funded with public money. The litigation I'm involved in as a plaintiff is working really hard to stop that on state law, religion neutral grounds. The idea that our state statutes require charters to commit to non-discrimination. St. Isidore has refused, and we're still approved by our board here. They've refused to. They actually have to file like an oath, and it has to be part of their contract that they're going to uphold those state statutes that require them to not discriminate. They refused, and they were still approved. So there's some like technical, what makes a charter, and what, did the board actually follow the statutes as far as what qualifies as a charter here in the state. So there's that attack that's being mounted through our litigation, as well as through the non-sectarian clause of our state constitution, what's sometimes referred to as a little Blaine amendment or a baby Blaine amendment. Our state constitution, like many state constitutions, I think it's like 37 states have some form of greater protection for the separation of church and state above and beyond what the First Amendment provides. Oklahoma is different. They're working through this litigation to try to protect that non-sectarian clause and uphold that non-sectarian clause, but it's going to be an issue, and it's potentially going to be an issue before a Supreme Court who may be hostile to it. And so, we have people from all over the country here on this talk. I encourage you to take a look at your state constitutions and see if you're one of the 30 plus states that have a quote unquote Blaine amendment in your state constitution, and what that could possibly mean if the Supreme Court were to rule that is somehow violative of the free exercise clause. And I've lost the thread about the prompt here, but that's what's going on in Oklahoma. It's a scary time. I'm involved in that litigation, and don't let it happen where you live. We'll talk about that at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we're going to pivot a little bit here. I want to talk about banned books because that's a big issue right now in a lot of places. So I want to ask, why is it important to not ban books, and what can young people do to fight banned books at their school?
Was that one? Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, if you want to start, go ahead. But
Well, I was a literature teacher, so I thought I would run with this one. It's
Do it.
really important not to ban books because people from every single walk of life need to see the point of view of other people, and you do that through literature. And so when they're banning books, they're in general banning books that are by LGBTQ authors, by people of color. I mean, they're going after all kinds of classics because they don't want kids to understand a different point of view. So why don't we ban them? Because kids need that point of view. Why are they banning them? Because they don't want kids to know the whole picture. They don't want them to understand, what's going on in the world, and literature helps them do that. And I'll say in places like Missouri, where I am, the book banners are coming in hot and heavy. And you know what? They're not even from Missouri. We have people trying to ban books in local schools that are coming from California or from Texas, right? Which is outrageous. Missouri, our education system, we're 50th in the nation for starting teacher pay. We're 49th in educational funding. We have a voucher scam. And what I'll say real quick before I let somebody else take this up, what these things mean for rural people is that our kids are going to schools that are defunded, and you can give someone like me 20 vouchers. It doesn't matter. I've got nowhere to take my kid. The closest school is 56 miles away, one way. And by the way, it's Catholic. We're not Catholic. So that's problematic. All of these schools end up being religious schools. We are sending public taxpayer funds to these schools to indoctrinate. This is where the true indoctrination is coming from. And y'all should know that I was born and raised a fundamentalist, a Southern Baptist. I know all about indoctrination. And that is what is going on in these schools, which is fine. If you want to pay for it and send your kid there, go for it. But taxpayer funds should not be going to these schools that aren't going to teach a complete, literature course or teach a complete history. And the reason we don't ban books is because these are things that kids need to have, full lives, and to not grow up to be bigots, quite frankly.
Yeah, I completely with everything that's been said. I obviously love books, as you can see behind me. When I was a kid, books sometimes were my best friends, especially when I was going through a hard time. And I think that's true for a lot of the folks on this call, and true for kids across the country. I became a language arts teacher after I got out of college, and I saw the power that books had, especially for kids who were different, or kids who were left out, or kids who were bullied or had been through some kind of trauma. And that power that books have is exactly why authoritarians throughout history have gone after books and gone after authors, whether it was Nazi book bans or Mao's Cultural Revolution. Censoring books, censoring authors is kind of a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. And so it's troubling that it's returning to the United States. Sometimes here in Texas, I wonder if it's 1924 instead of 2024, because we're having so many of these old fights come back up again. But the bill that got passed here in Texas, thankfully, was stopped in the courts. Unfortunately, a lot of our judicial system has become more and more partisan, but at least here in Texas, we're able to stop it through the judicial process.
I'm in Florida right now, and we did not. And so just to provide a little sort of First Amendment theory about why book banning is so bad is, again, part of what people have been talking about is we need to have that free flow of information, ideas, viewpoints to create a marketplace of ideas. Like everybody should have access to all different kinds of viewpoints, and the government should not be just censoring a viewpoint just because it doesn't like it. Another really important reason why we have books is not only is it a hallmark of democracy, it's necessary for democracy. You need to have an educated population to understand what kind of policies government should have and what kind of things they should vote for. And so the way to make sure that a government doesn't sort of entrench itself, hang on to power, is to have an educated citizenry. So that's partly why authoritarians like to censor books so much, because it makes it too easy for people to say, wait a second, I don't actually think your policy is the right policy, and I'm going to vote you out of office. The one other additional thing I would point out, again, thinking about free speech, is that there are, like, you can control speech in a school a little more than you can outside of the school. Like the government has some authority to choose a curriculum, and it has some authority to make sure that what students are exposed to at school are sort of legitimate, like age appropriate. So there may be sort of legitimate educational reasons to limit what is said and read in schools. However, right, even with this greater control that school districts may have over what happens in school, they still can't censor anything because they are hostile to the ideas contained within it or acting on a purely partisan basis. And I think that's very much what we're seeing across the country. And with laws like one we had in Florida where they banned any discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity and removed books that had even a single gay character in it. And so that's really what's happening here in Florida.
Thank you all. Now I want to hear a little bit more from Representative Talarico. And I want to ask you, what are the dangers of replacing school counselors with chaplains?
Oh, yeah. We're just going through a list of bad ideas on this call. So here in Texas, there was a bill that was passed that would allow school districts to replace school counselors with untrained, unqualified, unsupervised religious chaplains. Thankfully, we were able to stop this bill from being implemented in most of the school districts in Texas because folks showed up at the local level and called their school board members, organized their neighbors, and prevented the policy from taking place in their local communities, which again it should be a playbook for how we can push back against some of these Christian nationalist movements that are popping up around the country. So first, I some of you may know that I'm currently a seminary student in my part-time. When I'm not doing legislative stuff. And so I'm learning alongside students who are going to become chaplains. They're going to serve in our armed forces. They're going to serve in our prisons and our hospitals. And they are getting a master's in divinity. And they're taking coursework in mental health care. They're taking coursework in counseling. And that's great. But the bill in Texas did not have any standard in place. It didn't have any requirements that those chaplains have a master's degree or have any kind of degree. So you can literally go online, become ordained as a chaplain in 5 minutes, and now you're going to have unfettered access to our most vulnerable students in public schools. So we tried to put in place some of the basic guardrails that you would expect in a bill like this. And the author rejected every one of those amendments. Two other ones I'll mention. I put forward an amendment that would prohibit school chaplains from proselytizing or trying to convert students. That seems pretty common sense to most of us. That amendment was shot down. I also, this was, the bill author likes to champion parental rights. I put in an amendment that said a school chaplain can't meet with a kid unless they get parental consent, and that was shot down. So, I try to take people at their word. I try to have a good faith conversation and find compromise. But when folks don't even want to take the bare minimum of guardrails, you start to question their motives and what is this truly about? They say it's about helping kids with their mental health care, but I think the actions of the bill author expose the true motivation, which is to blur the lines between church and state.
I wanted to just quickly add that we've had the same. I would be surprised if it weren't just a copy paste of the Texas bill. I was telling the other panelists before we got started that Oklahoma is kind of like the little kid brother of all these bad policies. We see other states, Texas, Florida, Missouri, they're doing wild and wacky stuff. We don't want to be left out. So that bill was put forward this legislative session as well here in the state. Dead for now, but they're working on they have the ability here in Oklahoma to basically capture what's called a shell bill and fill in language after deadline. So they're working to do that to try and bring it back to life. But yeah, these policies are popping up everywhere.
Thank you. Now, how did the agendas of chaplains in schools and banned books align? Caroline, you want to start?
Well, the representative already said it. Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is what they have in common. So what is Christian nationalism? Well, the core belief is that the United States has always been and should always be Christian in its values, its images, its culture, and its law. And so, again, this is not about people who are deeply religious. This is about people who want the opposite of separation and church and state. They want to collapse church and state. And the other thing I would add is people who are all for Christian nationalism, it's not just a Christian nation they want. What they really want is a white Christian nation. And so I would say that really, again, it's this idea that we should be Christian, that real Americans are Christian. And if you're not a Christian, you're not a real American. And it is the opposite of what the Establishment Clause really recommends. And it recommends that separation for a very good reason. I just want to make I'm sure everyone here is a fan of the Establishment Clause, but let me just repeat what Madison said in his memorial and remonstrance and why it's so important to continue recognizing that we should keep them separate. Like, first, it keeps the peace, right? Anytime the government starts favoring having a favorite religion, religions start competing to be the favorite, and that leads to civil unrest. It's bad for the religion that becomes the government favored, because anytime religion becomes allied with the government, it invariably its integrity is compromised. And of course, right, you need to keep it separate to protect religious minorities, because without it, you're going to really jeopardize the equality of religious minorities. They're not real Americans. They're second-class citizens in Christian nationalism. And of course, you jeopardize their religious liberty, because now all the laws are codifying the religious tenets of the conservative Christians, which might be quite contrary to other people's own religious beliefs and how they want to lead their lives. So Christian nationalism was what they have in common.
Jess, do you want to add on?
Now, Christian nationalism. Yeah. I mean, separate the church and state. I know Professor has already spoken about the fact that we now can send public funds to private religious schools, but I don't care. I don't think that it's okay. And so whenever I see something, I say something. I've looked at the Missouri Constitution. It specifically says we do not send public funds to private religious schools. It says that, very clearly. They're doing it anyway. We're not in a space where, like in Maine, they didn't have public schools in a place. And so they were like, okay, this private school will send public funds there because that's the only place that kids can go. That's not happening in Missouri. What is happening is a voucher scheme. It's a scam for privatizers to come in and create schools. But again, in rural spaces, they're not coming in. So our money is just going to people basically who have already been sending their kids to private religious schools. They're just getting a coupon now. They're getting $7,000 in a voucher. So, the Christian nationalism is seeping in everywhere. I had a discussion with my state senator, and he told me I should read my Bible more. And I was just, I was talking about, paving our roads, but I guess maybe Jesus said something about that. I'm not quite sure, but that's what we're dealing with, is this constant fallback on, just like, Caroline was saying, you're not Christian enough, or maybe you're not Christian at all. And therefore, I am better than you. I'll tell you what to do. And so it's seeping into every part of our life, not just, education. It comes through with, reproductive rights. It's coming in every space in our life. And it's time for folks that have strong feelings about it to stand up. Even if you are a Christian, You should realize the founders didn't mean for this to happen. They didn't mean for our lawmakers to be using religion to create laws. And that's what Christian nationalism is. And so, time to stand up, friends.
I'll just quickly add on to that. The what we see a lot, and I know, Representative, you went viral recently for sort of roasting a lawmaker who was touting the history of using the Bible in public schools and reading Bible passages as part of the early stages of public education in the nation. But that history is not so it is not so settled. It was always controversial, to the point that everybody else has been making. It has part of this problem, the withering of the establishment clause that Professor Corbin was talking about earlier. We have shifted from the birth of our nation into the Reconstruction era, and now we're here away from this idea that establishment actually is a preservation of free exercise, to forcing governments into participating in the free exercise. And that shift, I would love to hear from someone more knowledgeable than me on the panel about when that shift really started taking place. As early as I can tell, maybe it's the Zellman case, but maybe it's before that. But even in the early stages of our nation's history, using the Bible in public school was controversial.
And the only thing I'll add, I think, I agree with everything that's been said so far. Jess mentioned that Christians should also speak out. I think it's particularly important that Christians speak out and use their religious privilege to resist this movement that's being launched in their name. It sounds like your Missouri lawmakers said he makes decisions based on the Bible. And, I can say again, as a seminary student, as the grandson of a Baptist preacher, they got to be careful what they wish for, because if we start making decisions based on the Bible, we're going to be forgiving debt and giving everybody health care. And so, what I think is important is what the professor said, that this is not just bad for our Constitution. It's not just bad for our democracy, but it's also bad for religion itself. And Dr. King said that if we mix church and state, suddenly the church will lose its prophetic voice, which, sadly, we've already seen that happening in this country as the two have gotten closer together. So if you're a person of faith who also happens to be secular, think about critiquing Christian nationalism on religious grounds and reminding folks that there is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism, and Christians should be standing with us as we resist this movement and as we protect our democracy.
Thank you. That was great. So I want to ask, if everything we've spoken about so far becomes commonplace, how likely is it that these ideologies will spread to the rest of the country? And what can we do to stop that spread? And why is it important to stop it?
If I could just say something. I'm in Missouri. I'm in a very rural space, 480 people in my town. I'm in cornfields and bean fields, and I'm already in this space. People do not separate religion from governance. And so I think it's very important for everyone to know that it's happening in other spaces. And so, Republicans in general use our states as playgrounds to get some terrible laws, or cases brought up and then fast-tracked up to SCOTUS to listen to. The reason that, a student debt we're having trouble getting it forgiven is because a case in Missouri that was fast-tracked up. The reason that Supreme Court Justice Alito was talking about gay marriage is because of a case from Missouri. So these states are impacting every single person. And I want to tell people that are in other spaces that aren't in red states, that are in Los Angeles, or in New York, you're not safe as long as these things are allowed to happen in states like mine, and states like Leslie's, and states like James's, right? So It's already here. It's time to link arms, stand up, talk back.
And I would say it's already here at a national level, because the Dobbs decision eliminating a constitutional right to abortion, I mean, you don't have to drill very far down to find at the core the religious belief that the moment of conception is the beginning of life and when the embryo gets a soul. And that's what's really, that's what drove the Supreme Court decision. And because of that, you know, everyone who can have a baby now suddenly no longer has autonomy over their own body. And so the consequences are here now. And unfortunately, I fear it can only get worse because they have their eyes now on contraception and on IVF and on same-sex marriage. And really undergirding opposition to all these things is a religious understanding. And I think it's really important to understand that, like, when abortion was constitutional and protected, everyone could live according to their own religious truth. If your religion counseled against abortion, you didn't have to have one. But if your religion requires an abortion, and honestly, under Jewish law, in certain circumstances, you do have to have an abortion, you too can live according to your faith. And that's no longer the case here. And I think, again, we'll see the same thing in other areas. And it's really, I'm worried. That's not hopeful, but it's true.
Yeah, agree with all of that. The only thing I'd clarify is it's really not a religious belief that life begins at conception, at least not in the Jewish or Christian tradition. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention was pro-choice until the 1980s. So this mixture of kind of right-wing political ideology and religion is fairly recent. And it's good to question some of these assumptions. Someone mentioned the kind of calling it the Christian Taliban, which I think is a good analogy, because the Taliban also perverted a beautiful faith tradition that is Islam and used it to achieve right-wing political ends, right? It was a way to control people, control what they read, where they travel, what they do with their bodies. It's a desire for control that's being masked by religion, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam. And the reason I say that is because if we're going to defeat this, we've got to build a broad coalition of all kinds of people, including people of faith. That is the only way we're going to defeat this thing. We can't just do it with secular students. We can't just do it with our atheist and agnostic friends. It's got to be all of us doing this together, because it's bad for all of us. The last thing I'll say is I think we as young people have to really be honest with our peers about what this means in 2024. Because Donald Trump, let's be honest, Donald Trump is not religious. I doubt he's ever opened a Bible, but Donald Trump is surrounded by religious extremists. And as long as they give him power, he gives them their policies, right? I don't know how Donald Trump personally feels about abortion. I'm sure he's paid for quite a few abortions in his time, but it didn't matter what his personal feelings were. He appointed the Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe v. Wade, and that is now the law of the land. And in states like mine, it means all abortions, including in cases of rape and incest, are banned, and women are dying in my state because of this. So I think a lot of young people are kind of thinking Donald Trump, it may be cool to vote for Donald Trump, but a vote for Trump is a vote for Christian nationalism. And people at least need to know that when they walk into that booth in November.
Thank you. I agree. Okay, so I want to finish this part with asking, what can we all do? Because all of this is so scary and horrible, and it can leave all of us feeling like, I don't know what to do. I feel helpless. And I'm sure everyone on this call as well. So in conclusion, if each of you could share, what can we do? And Jess, if you want to start.
I have people ask me all the time what gives me hope, and it's groups like this. It's young people like this. It's you guys that see what's going on, understand what's happening, are politically, activated, going ahead, and you're doing it with passion. So what you can do is, yesterday I was taking up I was taking up signatures for our abortion petition. We're going to put it on the ballot in Missouri. And I went to my local university, and about half of the kids that I asked to sign it couldn't because they weren't registered to vote. And that was shocking to me. So, the first thing that all of you can do, and this is what I learned too, there are folks within movements, there are people that show up to protest that are not registered to vote. And nothing matters, friends, if we don't take that step. So, please make sure that you are registered, that you're showing up, that you're voting your conscience, and you are going forward with everyone in your cohort to do better than what we've done thus far.
I agree, vote. I also need people to run for office. I need so many of my peers stepping up, running for school board, running for city council, county commissioner, statewide office, everything. Because if we don't have a good pool of candidates, then people like Ryan Walters, who is our superintendent of education, they win. I mean, the game is over if we don't have good choices. I know people in the chat are kind of talking about the presidential election right now, but look at who's running for school board this year in your district. Because the battle right now for me, especially on this topic, is right here in District 6. There's two people. There's one person who is a religious extremist, and there is a person who has her kids in public schools and just wants them to function. Who am I going to vote for? I'm glad she's running. I'm voting for her, the one that wants them to function. So, like, at the most granular level, think about running for office. Definitely vote, but think about running for office.
You know, I love the advice that's been given. I also want folks to be really engaged in politics, and that's not just being on social media and posting from your couch at home. That's actually doing the work in your community, joining organizations like this one, being at your state capitol, at your school board meeting, building relationships outside of your group, right? It's really comfortable, especially nowadays, to kind of stay in your little bubble, right? Especially where it feels safe and comfortable. And that's certainly true for folks who have been hurt personally, physically in these fights. But politics, if we're going to win, is going to require some discomfort. And that means reaching outside of our bubbles to try to build some of these coalitions. It means walking to a legislator's office to make your voice heard, which can feel really intimidating for a lot of people. But that's the only way we're going to win, is if we go out there in the real world and do this work. And it's not clean. It's oftentimes very messy, and you're going to have to make lots of compromises. But as long as you are strategic, as long as you persist, then we really do make change. It happens slowly, way too slowly. But I've seen it happen in my own state here in Texas. And so I would urge you to not think of politics as a hobby or an interest, because politics is life and death for people. And it requires your full attention and your full commitment.
I have nothing to add, but I'll say it again. Register to vote and vote. Register your like-minded friends and families to vote and make sure they vote. Get active in your local politics. And 3, right? Take the power. Don't stop wasting time trying to persuade people to do things. Become the people who do things. Become the school board member. Become the legislature. Become the judge.
Absolutely. And now everyone on this call is going to run for office, right? Yes. Awesome. So thank you all so much. I'm going to ask some questions that I have from the audience. And if you have a question, you haven't put it in there yet, go ahead and submit your question and I'll ask it. So we have from Patrick, has Oklahoma actually forwarded state funds to the Catholic charter school?
Not yet. They've approved the contract, and so the lawsuit is working to enjoin that transfer of funds before the next school year. We'll see if we get the injunction.
Cool. From Ray, states being forced to provide vouchers is probably the next step here in Maine, thanks to Carson v. Macon. Since funding private religious schools is forced if we fund private secular schools, we are trying to stop funding for all private schools. This is a long shot. Are there other states where the strategy is being attempted? Are there reasons for hope?
Well, I think there are certainly reason for hope. Here in Texas, we actually stopped our governor's attempt to pass a voucher scam in our state, and we did it by building a big coalition. It was Democrats, many of us from urban and suburban areas, partnering with rural Republicans from small towns around Texas. Jess mentioned the disastrous consequences vouchers have for our small towns and our rural communities, where the public school is not just a school; it's a community hub, and so we built that bipartisan majority in the Texas House of Representatives, and we stood strong for our students and for our public schools, and we refused to make this a partisan fight. This is not left versus right. This is top versus bottom. This is a coordinated plan by wealthy special interests, two billionaire mega donors in my state in particular, who are trying to privatize and dismantle the institution of public education and therefore the institution of democracy. You don't have a democracy if you don't have public education. And so we recognize that this was not Republican versus Democrat. This was a bunch of billionaires versus the rest of us who aren't going to benefit from voucher scams. It's going to take money out of our communities, out of our neighborhood schools, and give it to rich folks on the other side of town so they can afford, they can get a coupon on their private school bill. And so when you make it that fight, when you explain to folks what this is going to do to them and their communities, you can win. And so I encourage everyone on this call to join the fight against vouchers, because it is existential.
If I could piggyback off of that for just a second, what the representative is saying and what they were able to do in Texas, I think is a model for what we can do across the country. And that is bringing together rural Republican representatives with Democratic representatives to come together and say vouchers are not working for our communities. And rural folks know I knocked thousands of doors in the middle of nowhere in the sticks, and not one person came out and said, you know what, I'd like to close my local school and send my tax money to a private religious school. Not one. And I was talking to religious people by and large. So this is a fight that if we come together, we can win this by, putting together rural folks and Democrats.
It's the same thing in Oklahoma. Our effort, though, here, and I don't know how it's been structured in Missouri or Texas, but here, the way that they got it done, in spite of that opposition, because for a long time, rural constituencies were the only thing standing between us and a voucher program or a more universal program. We have some longstanding vouchers for students with disabilities, but like a universal program, rural communities were the stopgap. That changed last year through the creation of a tax credit program. So it's a voucher, but it's a tax credit. The interesting way that they're doing it is actually the check is being mailed. Once you send in all your paperwork about where you're being enrolled and all that, the Oklahoma Tax Commission is mailing the check to the school, but it's in the parent's name. Parent has to go to the school and sign it over immediately, but they can't send it directly with it made out to the school. It's made out to the parent, but sent to the school's address. I'm really going to be interested to see how that works out in the end. But the thing that gives me hope, or the thing that I think is important, is that a lot of people in Oklahoma are really asleep and disengaged. We have some of the lowest voter turnout in the nation. I mean, like it's bad here, but people are from all different kinds of communities are starting to realize that like their public school, to the representative's point, their public school is their community hub. And if that does not exist, their community doesn't exist. It goes away. And that's given a lot of people who otherwise have been disengaged or have been apathetic to really wake up and start caring. And we're getting organized. They've got the lead on us for sure. But I would encourage you, if you're working on this stuff in your own home states, organize. Get groups of people together, get different-minded groups of people together. That's great advice that we heard earlier. And talk about how this affects them directly, because that works and it moves people.
So true. Thank you. So from Ray, we have a question for Representative Talarico. What do you think of Supreme Court expansion as a solution to future issues?
Well, I think there certainly have to be structural reforms to the Supreme Court, whether it's adding members or whether it's term limits. I think the court as an institution is broken, and that's a problem in our system of democracy. So I'm all for those kind of reforms being made so that we have a Supreme Court that's performing its constitutional duty, because we're a lot closer to a constitutional crisis than we think when you kind of understand how the Electoral College and the popular vote work, and the way the Supreme Court is currently structured. So yes, I'm absolutely in favor of those reforms.
I'm going to chime in too as a constitutional law professor. It's just worth emphasizing that the Constitution does not specify the number of Supreme Court justices that have to be on the court. And so it is certainly constitutional to expand the number of justices. And this is not the first time this proposal has been made. There was a similar problem during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, where you had a very conservative Supreme Court that kept striking down his attempts to address the problems caused by the Great Depression. And he was the one who first proposed, well, what we really need to do is just have more justices. And it was proposed. It never really needed to take effect, because finally, at a certain point, the court tended to, it changed some of its rulings, and he eventually had people retire and he could replace them. So it wasn't necessary. But it's certainly, this is not the first time it's been proposed. It's certainly a possibility. Again, its effectiveness depends on who's going to be doing the appointing. And who does the appointing depends on who is the president, which brings us back to our earlier point about how important it is to vote.
Cool, thank you. So this is kind of a specific question, but will any of you be at the Summit for Religious Freedom in DC in April?
I am there. I'm on a panel. Please come.
I will not be, but I hope it's awesome.
Yes, I hope so too. Okay, so do we know of any laws being introduced either nationally or at a state level that are strengthening the separation of church and state? Is there somewhere to look for those things easily, and how can I find that?
I'm unaware of any, but I'm really only focused on legislatively speaking, I'm really only focused on Oklahoma.
I don't know of any, although I will point out that even if the US Constitution's Establishment Clause has been almost entirely eviscerated by this existing US Supreme Court, states have their own versions of the Establishment Clause. And so a lot of people are looking to challenge some of this Christian nationalist inspired laws by bringing challenges not under the federal Establishment Clause, but under their own state's Establishment Clause. And so, depending on the composition of a bench in the state, they might have some success at the state level.
I think it was kind of an answer in itself when there was no immediate answer, right? There's not many laws happening right now that are strengthening the separation of church and state. But yeah, thank you for that answer anyway. All right, so that was all of our audience questions. So thank you guys all so much for being a part of this panel. Everything that you said was so powerful and inspiring, and I mean, I think I'm about to go look up how I can run for office. So thank you also to the audience. You guys have been great, and that is the conclusion of today's webinar. Bye.